Good afternoon, folks. My name's Stu McKenzie. I'm the Science Manager with the Criminal Investigations and Network Analysis, or CINA Center, here at George Mason University. Thanks for joining us online today as we conclude our spring speaker series on developing university-based research that supports criminal investigations. As we're convening exclusively on WebEx today, please do mute your microphones if you haven't already done so. We have quite a large attendance today, and the background noise can stack up really quickly. As always, we will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. If you would like to submit a question, you can type it into the field on the right-hand side chat box in WebEx, and we'll direct that to Dr. Quas's attention. And we are getting a little bit of background noise from someone's microphone. So again, if you wouldn't mind muting, that will really help our speaker. While we're finalizing our full series of talks, this is a great time to sign up for our mailing list if you're not on it already. You can do this by sending one of us an email so that you're kept informed of upcoming events. This afternoon, however, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Jodi Quas. Jodi is Professor of Psychological Sciences in the Interdisciplinary School of Social Ecology at the University of California, Irvine. Her award-winning research has included work on children's eyewitness capabilities, abuse disclosure, and the consequences of legal involvement on child victims. Along with George Mason University's Dr. Alison Redlich, Dr. Quas is conducting CINA-funded research makes trafficking victims more or less reluctant to share information about those crimes. The title of her presentation this afternoon is Enhancing Disclosures in Victims of Sex Trafficking, Science Guiding Solutions. Jodi, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And if you're ready, I will hand off to you for your presentation. Thank you, ma'am.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you so much. This is actually really exciting. I'm delighted to be here, at least virtually. I guess the good news about these virtual talks is that they're really well attended. So I am really thrilled to be able to talk to everyone today about some of our work and our efforts focused on enhancing disclosures in victims of sex trafficking. Now, I want to start off today by stressing kind of the magnitude of this problem across not only the globe, but within the United States and, kind of in every single state. Media and the public attention oftentimes focuses on international victims of trafficking, especially those smuggled across the border against their will to be trafficked. But I want to stress that domestic trafficking, that is the movement of individuals from state to state and county to county, is equally significant, with large numbers of victims, including children and adolescents, being trafficked each year. In sex trafficking specifically, what we see in California is there are some youth who stay within their communities, but youth also move county to county with their traffickers, kind of especially from rural to urban locations, really highlighting that this is not just an international problem. This is a problem that really needs to be addressed at the national, state, and local level as well. Now, for those of you who are wondering, unfortunately, the pandemic and national and state stay-at-home orders have not stopped the trafficking from occurring. Girls and boys continue to be trafficked on the streets of Los Angeles, Orange County, where I am, and other counties across the state and country. Thus, there really does remain this continued need for significant attention to be directed towards preventing this heinous crime from occurring, protecting the youth who have been victimized, and prosecuting the perpetrators who exploit these youth. Now, in the past decade, there really have been kind of significant positive changes in efforts across the country to identify and intervene on behalf of victims. These include greater partnerships across government and private agencies so that efforts aren't duplicated and victims can be identified quickly. There are task forces that are cropping up in states, in counties, that are really integrating these different services and efforts to approach kind of these problems in a more holistic manner. There's also been kind of significant effort on the training front, really to identify some of the risk factors. So there are campaigns, if you see something, say something. There are lots of trainings now that are really focused on some of the risk factors that place youth in particular um, in situations where they're highly vulnerable to being exploited by others. But really, one of the challenges is that there's a crucial next step in this process. And this really focuses on the need to address what first responders and what we do once we identify those risk factors. That is, there has been far less attention focused on, well, what do you do when you see the risk factors? What do you ask of a victim? And yet, in order to protect a victim, to assess what the victim's needs are, and to prosecute a perpetrator, it's necessary to obtain information from the victims themselves. So that's really where a lot of this effort has now been directed, particularly in the work that I'm conducting with my colleague Allison Redlick, who is at George Mason University. We've really tried to turn around and say, okay, well, once you identify those risk factors, what do you do then? What kinds of questions can you ask to elicit information from suspected victims? Now, one of the nice things about beginning to pursue that question is that we actually can base what we know on an incredibly large body of very well-conducted scientific research focused on best practice interviewing of suspected child victims of other types of crimes. So, psychologists for the past several decades have been systematically and comprehensively evaluating forensic interviewing approaches for use with child victims and witnesses. This work has been highly influential and has led to the development of best practice guidelines that can be used to elicit information from suspected child victims in a way that leads to accurate accounts and does not also contribute to false reports. Scientists conduct trainings all over the world based on these guidelines. And in fact, the evidence surrounding these guidelines is so strong that there's been a push in recent years to begin to apply those same interviewing strategies to the questioning of immigrant youth who are required to be interviewed when they come into this country about victimization, violence exposure, and crime. And they're especially reluctant to disclose. Thus, as a useful starting point to today's talk, what I want to do is I'm going to first talk about what some of the basic findings are from this very large body of scientific work on forensic interviewing and how those might be applicable to trafficking victims. I'm going to talk about age and type of question. Then I'm actually going to take those and directly apply those to trafficking victims, what we know about type of question in these victims, and also then the broader context within which victims are interviewed. So when we step back and we look at this large body of scientific work on forensic interviewing, perhaps the most noteworthy finding and consistent finding is that concerning age. Young children in particular have been the focus of much of this work, and the evidence consistently indicates that even young children can describe their experiences, sometimes in quite an accurate manner, but their reports tend to be brief and incomplete. With age, children gradually provide more detail. They also are less susceptible to influences of questions in others. So there's a decrease in suggestibility. Also, and of interest with age, is that children actually begin to say, I don't know, more often. Anyone who's spent time with a 3 or 4-year-old knows that most 3 and 4-year-olds actually think they know everything. And it's not until they're older that they recognize that they don't. Now, these age-related improvements, we can begin with young children, But the evidence indicates that these age-related improvements continue through adolescence. So it's not as though children hit age 9 or 10 and then they suddenly become adult-like in their memory and reporting abilities. They continue to change. To give you just a couple of scientific examples, because I can't help it, that's what I do. In one study we conducted many years ago, we focused on children's memory for a medical procedures that they had experienced. Um, we can study children's memory for medical procedures because they're distressing, they're oftentimes invasive, and we also know exactly what happened. So we can examine children's memory reports for both completeness and accuracy. And just to kind of show you, when we said to children, tell me what happened, you can see this very clear age-related improvement. And this shouldn't be that surprising to people. This is a pretty common finding and something that everyone would expect if they spent some time with children. The purple bars go up, children's correct statements go up, and they don't provide across any age a lot of incorrect information when you just ask them to say what happened. Proportionally, these young children do provide a little more because they just don't say as much overall. Medical procedures are hard to control. Kind of random things can happen, so children's experiences vary. But we also conduct similar types of studies in a laboratory setting. And in these, you see similar age-related changes. So in some of our lab studies, we have children through young adults actually come into our laboratory and they complete a surprise speech and a math task in front of two very serious looking observers, as you can see here. And I promise you, this is a very kind of arousing laboratory-based situation. No one likes it. No one likes to give a surprise speech or do math in front of others. What we then do a few weeks later is we bring everyone back in and we ask them about what happened. So we know exactly what happened. We can see, well, how much do they remember? How much does their memory change with age when they're recounting this laboratory-based stressful experience? And what this shows is, again, you can see these correct details in the yellow and incorrect in the blue. When we just divide this out across each age ranges, you still see these consistent age-related differences. So your younger children in this study, it was 7 to 8-year-olds, are really saying less. And with age, they just provide more information. What's also really noteworthy about this is that really 7 and 8-year-olds through adults rarely provide incorrect information. So the reports, when you say, just tell me what happened, tend to be fairly accurate. Um, in this particular study, we also asked them closed-ended, which are yes, no, or single word answer questions, and we looked at their correct responses. What you can see here, these were very hard closed-ended questions, but you can see here the adults, in this study it was 18 to 25-year-olds, they did better. So not only do you have this increasing in how much information individuals report with age, but you also have greater accuracy in response to questions. To show you one more example of these age-related changes, in another study conducted by Dr. Allison Redlick, which is now considered a classic, they had children and adults play a computer game. And during the computer game, they were warned, do not touch the shift key or the computer will crash. Lo and behold, halfway through the experience, the computer crashed. And when these children and adults were told that they crashed the computer and they said, tell me how it happened, what you see is you see that when you actually put them under pressure, you see sizable numbers of especially the 12 to 13, but also 15 to 6-year-olds who will agree when they're told they did, even though in fact they did not touch this key. So you do see this false compliance decrease with age. So accuracy increases with age, even through adolescence, and errors decrease. So to kind of summarize just the basics, with age, the amount of detail provided in memory reports improves and accuracy of information provided improves. Adolescents are still susceptible to manipulation. They can also be led to err. So they're not immune to it, even if they think they are. They're also strongly influenced by motivations and perceptions in ways that shape both whether and what they elect to report. So, beyond age, though, the other, perhaps most influential aspect of kind of the forensic interviewing literature is how questions are phrased. Now, questions can be asked in a host of different ways to find out what happened to an individual. So, most often in the eyewitness, kind of in this forensic interviewing field, questions are heuristically divided into two broad categories. One we call recall questions or recall prompts or recall invitations. These generally include follow up prompts and WH questions like who, what, why. Those can be contrasted with closed-ended questions, which tend to be option posing, either or, what color, single word answer, or yes, no questions, and also suggestive questions. So questions that include presupposed information. So if a child hasn't disclosed that someone's wearing a hat and the question is, was the hat red or blue? That question presupposes that the child has already reported that there's a hat. So these recall invitations are generally described as these vague general prompts asking youth to report what they know or remember. So these are usually seen in forensic interviews towards the beginning. Tell me what you're thinking, tell me why you're here, tell me what you need. Across the board, these recall invitations or recall prompts really are largely considered the least controversial type of question that you can ask. They don't lead um, with any details. They're really kind of not embedding any information. They're very easy to answer. And it allows children and adolescents to say what they want. They have control over what the information that they're reporting is. And this control and this feeling of sort of being able to kind of dictate that conversation can actually be really useful when talking to adolescents who desire that control, who really benefit from feeling some of that control. So these recall invitations are largely considered the best kind of question you can ask, but there are some limitations to those. First of all, just saying to a child or an adolescent, tell me what you need, or tell me what you're thinking about, or why you're here, they may not know what you want to know. So they may start talking about a topic, but that's not what you as an interviewer are interested in, or you as law enforcement want to know about. And if it's not, then that requires you turn to a different kind of question to direct them. In addition, youth may not elaborate unless explicitly told to do so. Anyone who's talked to a 4-year-old, about their day and the child says, I played, knows that they're answering the question, they're just not elaborating. Adolescents may do that as well for a totally different reason. So they may not elaborate unless they're explicitly asked to do so. And finally, a limitation goes back to that same thing that's a benefit. Youth can say what they want and control the conversation. And so this same characteristic then can be a benefit, can also be a limitation because, especially with teens, they can only tell you, they can tell you just what they want to tell you. They can avoid topics if they'd like. Now, with these benefits and limitations, we have always trained interviewers that it's best to start out with these types of questions, but inevitably it happens that more information is needed. So because this more information is needed, there are a number of different approaches. Most often, what interviewers and law enforcement may do is go straight to these closed-ended questions. And really, if you don't get it in recall prompts, then you go, well, you start asking these very narrow and focused questions. Did he force you? Were his pants on or off? Or you were really scared, weren't you? And the challenge with those types of questions is that they can lead to errors. You already saw that when I showed you the examples of age-related changes in memory reporting, but once you move to these closed-ended questions, errors increase. They increase across age, including for adolescents, at rates that are higher than the errors exist for adults. In addition, beyond just leading to errors, they actually undermine children's credibility. Anyone who's been involved in a legal case knows that expert witnesses commonly come in and talk about children's suggestibility. And a lot of the issues around children's suggestibility involve the use of these closed-ended questions. So even if a child or an adolescent is answering these closed-ended questions correctly, because the questions are closed-ended, credibility can still be challenged. So to give you one example of closed-ended questions, this is a classic study, but in this study, it really included, I think, these important populations. So Johnson and Singh had adolescents watch a video, and then afterward, they asked them closed-ended questions repeatedly about the video. And what this shows, the interesting thing about this sample is that they included a group of delinquent youth and also a group of youth from the community. And so what you can see here is that the delinquent youth or delinquent adolescents made even more errors when they were asked these closed-ended questions than community youth. They also changed their answer when you ask them repeatedly about the video. Thus, what you can see here is these close-ended questions can lead to errors, and delinquent youth may actually be at greater risk for errors than non-delinquent youth. So another approach that has been very well tested in the forensic interviewing literature is via the use of what we call follow-up prompts and implicit encouragement. So follow-up prompts are really kind of ideal and easy types of prompts to embed after recall. And what they allow is, once a child or an adolescent has said one thing, you can say, oh, you said X, tell me more about that. And in that way, what you're doing is you are guiding the topic, you are kind of focusing a child on particular topics of importance without leading them down a particular path and without exposing them to potentially suggestive content that they have not already disclosed. Implicit encouragement is simply a broad category of kind of verbal and nonverbal cues that indicate interest in what a child says. And so the simplest of which is just a pause. And I promise you, if you ask a child a question and then you pause and it's silent, 90% of the time children will talk because they don't like the silence and they'll fill in the gaps. What they also will do is they will learn, if you pause multiple times, that it's their job to answer questions. Back channels are the uh-huhs, oh, okay, the head nodding types of things that you don't get at all when you do a virtual presentation, but when you're in a room, you actually can read an audience or you can read your interactional partner to know whether they're tracking, whether they're interested in what you're saying, whether they understand. Those types of implicit encourage strategies can be very beneficial. They're less controversial than closed-ended questions, and they're less direct. So they also reduce kind of feelings of pressure to report, and they really do allow a child to elaborate in a slower manner as they become more comfortable. To give you kind of one example of what these look like, I just took a transcript from an interview between a forensic interviewer and a child. So she begins by saying, tell me why your foster mom brought you here today. And the child says, well, I don't know, which is typical child answer. And she goes, oh, you don't know. Well, your foster mom's worried about something happened. Tell me what she's worried about. And the child says, she's worried I'll go back and my dad will touch me again. And so, of course, I picked out a perfect transcript so you can see this example in a really easy manner. But once the child says that word touch, what the interviewer does is she goes, oh, that your dad would touch you again. Tell me more about that. So she pulls the exact phrasing from the child and uses it and follows up with a tell me more prompt. And of course, because I'm giving you the perfect example, the child does just that. So the child actually talks about what happens, and she's talking about how she loves everyone, and that's why he's still with her mom. So to step back and to say, okay, well, based on this literature, what should you do? Begin with recall prompts. Across the board, you should be doing this with all witnesses. They're the least controversial, the most likely to lead to accurate information, and follow up with tell me more prompts whenever possible. Avoid, to the extent possible, closed-ended and suggestive questions. Certainly some closed-ended questions may need to be asked, but what we also encourage and recommend is that you follow those with tell me more prompts. So as I mentioned, all of the science that has kind of led to these recommendations has really been well vetted. These guidelines, though, the victims in the studies that have focused on these strategies typically range from young children through adolescents. The research has largely concerned interviewing 3 to 12-year-olds, with some studies going up to about age 14. When you look at the victim population to which these interviewing strategies are applied, one of the ways that most victims are actually identified is via their own disclosures. So most victims, for example, of child sex abuse, either intentionally or unintentionally tell someone else, which then prompts an investigation. And then kind of a social worker or a forensic interviewer may then question the child more. The interviews as well, when children make these sorts of disclosures, even if it's unintentional or even if it's partial, children are typically routed to child forensic specialists. These may be in child advocacy centers or multidisciplinary interviewing centers, but these are really kind of highly trained specialists who have conducted these interviews, they focus on children, and they're usually very well trained to follow general guidelines and protocols when they're conducting these interviews. The reason I want to make these points is that when you look at attempts to apply these guidelines just in a straightforward manner to trafficked youth, a number of issues already come up. So unlike the child witness literature and kind of the forensic interviewing, most trafficked youth, by the time they're identified by the authorities, are adolescents. They're teenagers, not children. They also rarely disclose on their own. They tend to be picked up because they're engaged in delinquency or prostitution or gang activity, or they're identified in medical facilities based on kind of their history of medical treatment. Many of them have histories of child maltreatment, and they have been embedded in the dependency and foster care systems. In addition, most victims, if their status as a victim is unknown, because they're being kind of picked up via these other mechanisms, they're at times arrested and they're interrogated as a suspect. They also are rarely questioned by forensic interviewing specialists. Now, these child forensic interviewing specialists are in child advocacy centers um, or otherwise kind of locations for children, and these are adolescents. But most trafficking victims are questioned by law enforcement. So they might be questioned by local police, FBI, ICE agents, not forensic interviewing specialists. Sometimes as well, known victims are actually detained. And this is really a struggle because, you don't want to release an adolescent back onto the streets, but when you don't know what to do with them, they may actually be detained for their own protection. All of these experiences and characteristics, however, make it very difficult to take a literature that's been very well vetted but developed for child victims and apply it to suspected adolescent victims of trafficking. So what we've been doing, again, and this is in part with Allison Redlick, funded by CINA, in addition, funded by the National Science Foundation and then the UCI Initiative to End Family Violence, is we've been trying to disentangle and focus on what types of questioning strategies work and don't work with adolescent victims of trafficking, and also what types of prosecution strategies may and may not be successful with this very unique population. So some of the questions that we've been pursuing is first, just very simply, whether similar questioning approaches are used with both of these populations of victims. In addition, though, what we've also become interested in is whether trafficking victims are actually considered victims and how they're actually treated and how they're kind of folded into trials against traffickers. And finally, what we've also been focused on is traffickers' recruitment behaviors. Victims' disclosures and victims' participation is crucial to a case. Thus, it's really important to see what types of characteristics within their history and their relationship with the trafficker are going to affect their willingness to disclose, their kind of cooperation, and their evasiveness when interacting with law enforcement and eventually legal professionals. To kind of turn to kind of just to show you kind of what the findings from some of this new research look like, what I first want to do is I just want to show you some comparisons. And these are from, on the one hand, a relatively small sample of interviews, but within these interviews, they each have hundreds of questions asked. But what we did is we actually compared what the interviews looked like between child sex abuse interviews. So interviews with children ages 5 to 14 when there are allegations of sex abuse. And we compared those to interviews of suspected victims of trafficking. So when we looked at kind of what the interview profile looked like, what you find in sex abuse interviews is about 8% of the questions are tell me what happened, these recall invitations. And then about 51% of these are these follow-ups. So when a child says something, there's, oh, you said X, tell me more about. And there's about 41% closed-ended. So I mentioned that closed-ended questions are inevitable. They are at some point in an interview. And even in well-trained interviews, these are about the percentages that you see. When we looked at adolescent trafficking interviews conducted by law enforcement, what we see is we already see kind of a really different pattern. So first of all, we see less than 1% of the questions are these recall invitations. Tell me what happened. In addition, there are also far fewer follow-ups. Tell me more about X, and a greater percentage of closed-ended questions. So these are the different patterns of just what the questions look like. So right off the bat, when you look at the interviews, they're very different between these two populations. Now, the two populations themselves are very different. And so it may be that, it's just necessary to question adolescents in a different way. So what we then did is we've now begun to look at, well, what are victims saying across these two victim types? How much information are they providing? Are they kind of giving useful substantive information about the crime itself? When we look at the child sex abuse victims, there is low unresponsiveness. So they are providing information. Again, though, I mean, in a way that makes sense. I mean, most of these victims are identified because they've disclosed previously. So when they get to a forensic interview that's conducted by a very well kind of structured interview, I mean, they know what they're supposed to be talking about, and they generally provide that type of detail. They also provide what we consider legally relevant information to these open under these recall prompts. And they have generally low levels of unresponsiveness, even to closed-ended questions. When we then turn to adolescent trafficking victims, they also have very low unresponsive. So, these are adolescents. These are pretty savvy adolescents. They know they have to answer questions posed by law enforcement. So they're also low in unresponsiveness. But when we dig deeper into the content of what they're saying, what we're finding and is that they're evasive. We could have kind of called this adolescent sassiness, but they are providing information that seems to be less helpful. So, I just pulled one excerpt from this to kind of show you, and anyone who's on law enforcement is probably nodding their head because they've questioned adolescents, and any adolescent may behave like this. But, it's who was trying to work you? Some guy. It's a guy. Who is he? Somebody I know. So, certainly the victim's answering the questions. She's just not answering it in a particularly useful way. Um, and what that may do, that evasiveness may be the trigger for, well, that's why you have to ask more closed-ended questions, because they're not answering. In addition, when we looked at even the unresponsiveness to the closed-ended questions, you see this increase quite a bit. So already it looks like these interviews are really unfolding in a different manner. And it may be, what we don't know yet is it that, adolescents just react differently? Is it the nature of the population? Is it the nature of law enforcement's approach? Right now, we just don't know because we're only looking at small sets of these. But it certainly suggests that what we really need to do is to begin to look both at adolescents, who may just be different entirely in the way we approach interviewing them compared to children, or is there something unique about these trafficking victims? In addition to our initial investigation of some of the interviews, we're also looking at criminal cases against traffickers. And the way that we've been doing this is we've decided, obtaining interviews of actual interviews can be very difficult. We've been lucky to obtain small sets. But to complement that, what we've now been doing is we've actually gone in and we're now collecting transcripts from criminal trials. Now, there are a number of benefits to collecting these transcripts. First of all, transcripts of criminal trials are publicly accessible. We can look at attorneys' questions. We can look at the types of evidence that seems to be important and discussed in these trials. We can look at victim cooperativeness, traffickers' behavior as it's described in the trial, and victim complicity with the trafficker. So we really can gain really comprehensive insight into a broad range of characteristics that are likely really important to criminal prosecution of traffickers. Now, this is a complementary approach, and I don't want to claim that this is the best approach because there are some limitations that I always want to kind of highlight at the start. First of all, we are only coding cases that went to trial because those are the cases, excuse me, that are publicly accessible, that actually have transcripts. What that means is that cases that have incomplete or non-useful disclosures are probably not included. Uncooperative witnesses are potentially cases that aren't included, or cases with really strong evidence that leads to an immediate plea. So, so there are limitations as a approach. It also doesn't provide insight into law enforcement questioning strategies. And so with the increase in special units focused on trafficking, what we've really begun to do is talk to law enforcement because we think those units may have developed organically some strategies that potentially could be useful in kind of broader communities as these victims come into contact with different agencies. But what do our data kind of look like? Well, right now, we've collected just 2 California counties over a 5-year period. We have 64 trials, and 86% of them were ended in guilt. There are 60 male, there are actually 4 female traffickers, and the number of youth victims in these cases ranged from 1 to 7. So in a way, this is a small set right now, but each of these trials has about between 500 to 1,000 questions asked of the victim in the trial. So we are able to really look in detail at what types of questions are asked and what victims answer. What it looks like right now, at least at a case level, kind of not at the individual question level, is first of all, the attorney questions. There are some hints that these are mostly closed-ended, and that's pretty similar to what we've seen in the past with child victims when they're involved in child sex abuse criminal cases against a perpetrator. So attorneys tend to be pretty focused because they know what they want to obtain from a witness. They also, though, are very temporally disjointed. And when I'm talking about attorneys, I'm actually including both prosecutors and defense attorneys. Defense attorneys may be disjointed for a strategic purpose, but prosecutors, you wouldn't think so. But by temporally disjointed, I mean they're jumping over time, kind of asking questions and then going back and forth. And what this can do is it can actually be difficult for a witness to follow, but it can also undermine credibility. When victims are kind of having to jump back and forth, it also requires that a jury track back and forth in time, and that can be difficult, and it can make a victim look less credible than he or she is. So there are a few concerns about that. In addition, one of the more interesting things that we're really starting to think about is that victims in these cases seem to be described very consistently as complicit, and their problematic or delinquent behavior is really featured prominently in these cases. Um, and while sometimes victims' behavior may be relevant, oftentimes it's not to the actual charges themselves. Thus, we're finding it really interesting that even though there's been a push to recognize trafficking victims as victims, these trials still seem to feature very prominently some of the victims' behavior. So, I want to go on just for a few moments and just kind of talk about stepping back for a moment to think broadly about the approaches that we can use when we're questioning these victims. I focus on the questions themselves, but the context surrounding the victims is also incredibly crucial to what victims say. So across the board, another finding from the forensic interviewing literature is that youth are more accurate when they're questioned in an intimidating context. And these benefits are really consistent across age. They're strongest with young children, but you really do see these with adolescents. And so when adolescents are interviewed in a warm, supportive manner, in a relaxing manner, they tend to do better than when they're interviewed in an interrogation room, in a cold and neutral setting by individuals who maintain a more professional rather than calming demeanor. In our previous study of supportive context that I discussed, we actually, in some of those studies, manipulated the interviewer behavior. So we would have the interviewers question the children and adolescents in either a very kind of sparse room, and I don't have a picture of it, but we actually had the interviewers sit in a very formal manner, read from a script, versus kind of sitting close to the child, leaning in, using back channels. And then what we did is we compared their performance. And so I'm just very quickly going to show you these data. When youth across age are questioned by a supportive interviewer, they tend to be more accurate. So kind of context, even when all the questions are the same, the context itself can be influential and can shape their responses. So that sort of how the adolescents are picked up, how they are kind of brought in, how they're interviewed, how they're questioned, their perceptions, those are all going to shape their accuracy. So kind of the final things about context, and these are really coming from frontline law enforcement. The Orange County Task Force, where I am, has kind of a really great model for this. But the context also includes food. Many of these kids, when you pick them up, they're hungry. They haven't had food. And I have hot Cheetos because my 17-year-old said that that's the best food on the planet. So that's always kind of our go-to food when you need to question someone who's a little nervous. In addition, rest, sleep. Many of these victims haven't slept consistently in a safe place for a long time. So kind of get them food, let them rest, be supportive, but know that they may be evasive. They may provide answers that aren't that useful. But that doesn't mean that that support should end. And finally, ask about and address their needs. There's an increased push to involve medical professionals to do STD testings and the like. So really make sure that their needs are being addressed. And so kind of to close this out, I think that we're moving in a fantastic direction to really begin to understand the needs of these victims and how to question them. One of the things that we're really pushing for is we really need to know what's happening on the law enforcement end, given that these victims are being questioned by law enforcement. What we've been talking to different counties about is maybe they do have uniquely effective strategies for this victim population. If we can pool information across agencies and look at those interviews in more detail, we may be able to kind of identify some of those common threads to begin to make recommendations specific for this population. In addition, what we also need to do is we really need to begin to focus on first responders to make sure that they are kind of well informed, not only about the risk factors for trafficking, but also about disclosures, tendencies, and interviewing approaches. Because once they identify those risk factors, they're the ones who need to ask those questions in a way that elicits information. And if we can do this, we really are in a better position to identify victims. And identifying the victims is really a crucial step, both to providing services for those victims, but also for ensuring that justice is served for all of our youth.